There's nothing more frustrating than comparing your brand new mix to a professional reference track and hearing that your mix just sounds flat and lifeless. So how do we fix a flat sounding mix, or better yet, prevent one from even happening in the first place? The answer lies within the cue. In one of my other videos, the 23 Nails video, I talk about the importance of understanding depth, width, and height in mixing. This video will be the first of a 3-part deep dive series on achieving a 3-dimensional and immersive sound. And no, I'm not talking about Atmos. And for part 1, we'll be going into the depths on depth. You know, the longer I produce and mix music, the more I realize just how similar our work is to artists, painters and drawers specifically, and even magicians. Take a look again at this cube we highlighted a moment ago. Is it actually a cube? No. Is it actually 3-dimensional? No. Are magicians actually dismembering human beings? No, I sure hope not. Are they extremely good illusionists? Yes. As producers and engineers, we're tasked with the same exact challenge that magicians, painters, and drawers are faced with, and that's creating the illusion of that third dimension, space and depth. If we look at a 2-dimensional square, you only have length and width as your dimensions. That's what makes it flat and not very interesting. Actually, let's look at the definition of flat. The first definition is smooth and even, without marked lumps or indentations. The second definition is more interesting and useful for us artists and producers: lacking interest or emotion, dull and lifeless. Why do we, or should we, care about space and depth in our mix? Let's think for a second about the spaces I recorded my intro in. Each space has its own unique way of reflecting the sound back at our ears, depending on the size, shape, and material of that space. They each have their own unique sonic characteristics that trigger our emotions in different ways, even if on a subconscious level. Hearing someone talking in a stairwell versus your kitchen versus your living room will each have different emotional connections. Spaces draw us in some way or another. We're immersed in them all day, every day, and are used to the reflections, and rarely, if ever, stop to critically listen to those spaces. So, if the definition of flat is lifeless, and the only thing differentiating 2D from 3D is space and depth, then really space is what breathes life into our mix. Interestingly, one of the main ways to determine the time period of a song is by listening to the type of reverb and delay used in the mix. The nostalgic sound of the classic records from the 50s and 60s primarily comes from that era's limitation of tools to create space. They didn't have the digital tools we have today, and instead employed physical chambers, halls, metal plates, springs, tape echo, or anything really that could be mic'd up that would reverberate. If we think about the opposite of a reverberant space, that would be an anechoic chamber, which has zero reflection and is therefore very lifeless and uncomfortable to be in. That is not opinion or theory, that's fact. In fact, an anechoic chamber is so disturbing that the world record for time spent inside of one is only 67 minutes. I was actually expecting longer than that, but I've never been in one myself. The type and amount of space you might like is pretty subjective, and by adding the right kind and amount for the music, you can create real depth and breathe life into your mixes, and enhance the overall emotional connection for the listener. And the more we understand how space reacts to sound and the tools with which to manipulate it, the more control we can have over the depth and placement of our various instruments and sounds in a mix. Okay, with all that said, how does this actually translate to achieving depth in our mix? Well, the reverbs from different types of spaces will position your sounds in varying degrees of depth, which is the front to back dimension of the cube I mentioned earlier. A singer recorded in a classic chamber with hard reflective surfaces will sound further back than a singer that was recorded in a room with a short reverb decay time. Check it out. So here I have a vintage verb with a chamber setting, and that's set to 30% wet, and this LXP native room reverb set to 30%. And the parameters are different so that they can emulate those specific spaces. And notice how the chamber reverb causes a little bit more distance for the vocal than the room reverb.
Lift me up, make me feel like I'm the only one that you love. Nothing lasts forever, so
And then the room.
lift me up, make me feel like I'm the only one that you love. Nothing lasts forever, so
Again, listen to how the placement of front to back changes when I go from chamber to room.
lift me up, make me feel like I'm the only one that you love. Nothing lasts forever, so lift me up, make me feel like I'm the only one that you love. Nothing lasts forever, so
But the front to back is actually not the only way to manipulate depth. Panning, although primarily associated with the left to right placement of sounds, can also affect depth. For example, sounds that are panned centrally in mono can seem closer than sounds that are spread wide in stereo. Let's check this out with the chorus effect. Now this tune's like a little ridiculous. I get it. But listen to this minor third. So in the chord, that's the minor third out of everything. Let's play this. Right? Listen to how when I engage this chorus effect, and I've added some gain compensation because we're losing about 5 decibels when I add this chorus. It pulls it back in volume. Listen to how this really kind of gels in with the mix and has its own sense of space without really adding reverb, just by adding that width from the chorus. Off. On. Off. On. So even with the decrease in gain, right? Like if I were to gain match these completely and bring it up to like 5, it's just kind of throwing off the balance of where I want that to sit. It's not just volume that's pulling it back in the depth dimension, right? That front to back. It's not going back just because of volume, because there's now sort of that sense of depth and space from the stereo effect of this chorusing. That's pretty useful observation, because now we can go to our mix and say, okay, let's not think about right and wrong necessarily. Let's just think about what tools I have that can accomplish placing instruments and vocals and sounds in various degrees of that depth dimension, right? That just gives us more control over placing our sounds anywhere we want in the mix to create separation and overall depth. What's interesting here is that the closer a sound source gets to a microphone, even if it's a stereo pair, the more central and mono sounding it becomes, and the less reverberant space we hear around it. And as we just demonstrated with the reverb comparison, the room reverb made the vocalist more upfront than the chamber reverb did. So naturally, reverb and stereo imaging are pretty closely tied to each other when discussing depth. How about the spaces that I recorded my intro in? Let's take a look and listen to those and make some observations on how those different spaces affect the front to back placement of my vocal. Okay, so I've imported all of the audio files from my intro, right, in the different spaces. We have the parking garage first, we have the stairwell, the office lobby, the kitchen, and my house, and then my studio and my basement. So I attempted to create a feeling that we were going from a further kind of distant space to more forward and up front. And I think I achieved that in just these last two, right? Like it gets clearly more dry and up front and forward. So what I want you to do is see which of these spaces are kind of putting the vocal back further in distance versus more forward in distance. There's nothing more frustrating than comparing your brand new mix to a professional reference track and hearing that your mix just sounds flat and lifeless. Okay, for me, I didn't really get this right. I have these first three sort of in the wrong order in terms of distance. I think that the space that has the most feeling of distance is this stairwell here. Let's listen to that. Then comparing your brand new mix, and then it's going to be the office lobby after that, and then the parking garage would actually be third to me. To a professional reference track. Okay, so listen to these two. Then comparing your brand new mix to a professional reference track. This one, the office lobby, has a nice long reverb tail. Track. Like it goes for a while. Listen to the reverb tail of this stairwell. New mix. Okay, the reverb tail dies out quicker in the stairwell, but it feels like the stairwell vocal is more distant and that the office lobby vocal comes up more forward. Listen to that again. Pairing your brand new mix to a professional reference track. And I've got these volume matched like pretty good. Then comparing your brand new mix to a professional reference track. It's because the stairwell has walls that are tighter in distance, and it's very much just like concrete all around me, like floor to ceiling. There's a nice kind of long cavity as well. It's like we're turning up the wet dry knob more and just putting more reverb effect on this vocal, this stairwell here. And so that kind of has a sense of like kind of the way that chambers behave. Right? Chambers are very much just like a bunch of concrete, or just chambers can be all kinds of materials and whatnot, but it's just really bare bones. It's just, there's a lot of reflection, right? And then this office lobby, different shape, much larger, longer reverb decay time. Track. Because there's like more late reflections, or I shouldn't say more late reflections, but it's just a bigger space. So it's taking longer for the reverb to travel. And so the reverb is like turned down in terms of mix. Now we can, after these observations, we can then say, well, if I have a long reverb decay time, but my mix is down, it's not going to feel as distant as something with a shorter decay time that is really dense and has, you know, the reverb turned up. Brand new mix. More, right? And then the parking garage is the largest space. Same with like the stairwell, it's all concrete, right? Frustrating. It sounds like there's a quicker decay time, but in reality, if I yell, I bet I'd probably get a longer reverb tail here. It's because it's such a large space, the vocal has much more volume than the reverb does, right? Whereas like the stairwell, the reverb is like right there, right? It's reverberating just right close to me. The like early and late reflections are kind of both happening at the same time and are just a lot more dense. And this is all just to like, you can translate all this. Like everything that we're hearing in nature here is stuff that we can translate to the types of reverbs that we choose to use in our mix. Do I want something to sound more forward? Right? Have it more dry, right? This kitchen here. And hearing that your mix sounds way more up front than this, a professional reference track, or this, your brand new mix, or this thing more frustrating, right? Like these two should be stairwell in terms of like the order of back to front. It goes stairwell, in my opinion, and then this, and then this, and then this, and this, right? So let's see if that works. Let's see if we can listen and hear the vocal come more up front as we progress here.
Comparing your brand new mix to a professional reference track, there's nothing more frustrating. And hearing that your mix
And lifeless, right? Going from back to front. Hopefully that's useful information, and we can translate that to how we set up our reverbs, within our plugins. Okay, that's great, but still, how do we tangibly translate all this to our mix to achieve more depth? Let's get into an actual mix session and break down each way that I manipulate the depth dimension. Here I have a mix for a song called Follow My Voice by a fantastic band, Book on Tapeworm. And let's go ahead and start with volume and discuss how volume is being used to put instruments front to back in different degrees. And we'll start with the pre-chorus here. And just pay attention and make note which instruments sound more up front and which sound further back. And then we'll sort of see if that correlates with the volumes.
Feeling you get swallowed up by the static. I hope
Clearly, the loudest thing is going to be this lead vocal, Scott Shepherd's voice.
feeling you get swallowed up.
Sitting about negative 9.2.
Feeling you get
Compared to these backing vocals, which are hitting
feeling you get
like negative 18, right? So clearly volume is being used to push those backing vocals behind. That's one thing. Obviously there's, some spatial processing going on to help as well. Listen to other instruments. How are those, relative to each other in terms of volume? In fact, let's go ahead and just like mute these vocals and listen to just the instrumental. Okay, so we have the string section here. This is like one of the main string elements that is hitting up to about negative 12 there, negative 10, and then solo violin. So let's see how loud that is. So that's hitting less. There's more high frequency information. We don't have to turn this up as loud as we do with, the solo cello. I can hear those equally just as well, even though our cello is like a whole 7 dB or more up above this solo violin. Okay, so now we can think, okay, high frequencies can help bring a sound more forward, right? In addition to volume or back, vice versa, right? And then everything else is just quieter because we're tucking those things back. This flugelhorn is one of those things. Play that again, solo. Okay, let's mute these other main elements here, those two kind of main string elements, and listen to everything else. So now I'm hearing some like deeper kind of like bass or lower cello string instruments. And then there's another, okay, the Scarby keys. Cool. There's a lot of spatial processing on these. This is going to an H delay with a ping pong delay, creating a lot of space, and we'll discuss that in a sec here. But anyway, you get the point here, right? The really simple tool of volume can help us go, okay, front to back, and you can use that to effectively place your instruments in varying degrees of depth. All right. Let's go now to the use of EQ and how that can change the depth perception. We've already talked about how that solo violin being higher in frequency can come more up front, right? And so we can essentially do the opposite and maybe cut the highs on something to have it tuck back in a mix as well. So I want to point that out in these backing vocals here. What I've done is I've rolled off the high end. There's a negative 5.8 dB shelf at 7100. And on this one, same thing. This one's got about the same move there. So let's go ahead and toggle this on and off on these backing vocals in the mix and see how when I don't have that shelf and I let those high frequencies through, how that brings the backing vocals more forward than I want. So here's with the shelf.
Feeling you get swallowed up by the static.
Let's take that shelf off.
Feeling you get swallowed up.
So now it's like coming a little bit more forward. And let me just toggle that off and solo these again. Okay, and then off. Lots of high frequency information there that's going to bring it more forward. Here's with the shelf on in the mix. That's more distant than this. It's like bringing it so much further forward. And that's not like a massive move, in the grand scheme of the frequency spectrum, but it's making a big difference in terms of pushing that back further in the mix beyond just the volume difference, right? If it was just volume, I'm not quite getting what I want. I still want to hear the vocal, right, with the volume that it is. I don't want to have to tuck it back further, so I'm just shaving off that high end a little bit in order to keep the intelligibility of the volume, but have it feel more distant. As sounds go further away in nature, the high end sort of gets diminished. All right, let's move on to reverb and delay. That's the most fun tool, I think, to use when it comes to creating depth. And first I want to show and point out this lexicon reverb that I'm using by UAD. It's called Cello Bridge, but it's actually in the chorus here. So let's go ahead and solo that. Nice and rich. Sending to this lexicon reverb here. All right, so let's hear in the context. Now that you can hear that, let's listen to the context of the mix.
If you're lost in the noise, you can follow my voice. Follow my voice.
Okay, let's turn it off and see how it changes the front to back placement of that cello.
If you're lost in the noise, you can follow my voice. Follow my voice.
Now this is with the reverb on.
If you're lost in the noise, you can follow my voice. Follow my voice.
Off.
If you're lost in the noise, you can follow my voice.
Brings it up. Here's on.
If you're lost in the noise, you can follow my voice.
Now it's occupying a space. It's giving it that depth for sure. Let's move on to the violin organ in the second verse. I want to point that out. This is a little bit more subtle. Okay. Right now I have it off. This is actually a ping pong delay with the H delay. So set to ping pong mode. So that means it's going to hit the left and right. The delay will hit the left and right speakers back and forth. So listen to the space that it's. This is already, like without this, right? It's already a stereo track. When I engage this ping pong delay, listen to the sense of space it adds and the depth. Here's it on now. So that's how we can make something that's already stereo have even more depth to it, right? So let's go ahead and listen to the context of the mix. It's going to be subtle, but really listen carefully. So here's with the delay engaged.
Inside voices saying things that make you feel scared.
And here's off.
Inside voices saying things.
Very subtle, but really listen to the space it adds when I put it back on and how it kind of lets it breathe.
Inside voices saying things that make.
And that's great because it's letting it breathe a little bit more, giving it more depth, and I'm not having to drown it in a bunch of reverb, and I can create some separation, because I've got reverb on some other elements. The difference of using like a ping pong delay on one thing and then a reverb, some reverbs, different reverbs on maybe some strings is going to have a different character on those spatial effects, which is further going to create separation aside from the fact that it's just a reverb and delay, right? So you have less decay time sort of, or a different type of decay, I guess you could say, in the ping pong delay than the reverb. And that's going to create, again, that sense of separation and just slight differences in sort of that front to back dimension in the left and right as well. Last thing that I want to point out is how transients can really change that front to back as well. And I'm going to demonstrate this. There's not a lot of super high transient information outside of some of the plucks that we've got in some of these string instruments. So I want to show you, I've got this thing called the palm muted piano, which is not a piano. It's like pizzicato violas or something. And if I hit this transient master, turn this on, I've got it all the way cranked up. So we're going to get more punchy plucks. Just that front end transient is coming up in volume. It's going to draw our ear and it's going to make it pop out in the mix a lot more. Let's go ahead and listen to this on and off. So here's off.
Inside voices.
That's blended right in with the other instruments. And then when I turn the transient master on,
Inside voices telling you things that you don't.
it's poking out too much. If I turn this back off, listen to how much it gets sucked back into the mix.
Inside
Blends in.
voices telling you
Here's on.
things that you don't want to hear. And outside choices
And then off.
are making it harder for you to think.
So now we know that transients affect the front to back placement. If I wanted a vocal to come more forward, I could leave some of the transient information in by, let's say, having a slower attack on a compressor so that the compressor isn't clamping down on those front end transients, right? Whether that's drums or whether that's a vocal or anything, now we know that that's going to help place that instrument in a certain sort of like distant front to back distance, depending on how much transient we leave in. Okay, the last thing that I want to do is kind of reveal what all of my spatial processing is doing to add depth and to take this mix from being a super flat and lifeless mix. So we're bringing this demo full circle. The title of the video, after all, was Pro Mixer Demonstrates Fixing a Flat Mix. So let's listen to how flat the mix sounds, how lifeless it sounds without any of the reverb and delay processing. So there's a few different types of delays. There's ping pong delay. Let's go ahead and check it out here. There's echo boy. That's just like a standard single echo. There's this H delay, which is a ping pong delay. There's, let's see, different reverbs here. We've got the lexicon reverb, a little bit of delay mixed with reverb, and then this plate reverb. So we've got different types of reverbs creating different feelings of depth. There's a lot of intention behind this spatial processing here to bring life into this mix. So let's go ahead and mute all of this processing and play the chorus here.
If you're lost in the noise, you can follow my voice. Follow my voice.
So we got quite a ways with just volume and EQ and dynamics processing, right? And panning, our basic tools, we got it to a great place. Listen to how this breathes life.
If you're lost in the noise, you can follow my voice. Follow my voice. If the world gets too loud and it's drowning you out, you can follow my voice. Follow my voice.
There you have it. Now, outside of volume, there are so many different tools in each of the categories that we've covered. Seems like today there's hundreds of EQs, hundreds of delays, hundreds of reverbs, hundreds of dynamics processors, etc. I want to challenge you to get really familiar and go deep with learning to use the plugins you already have. Really limit yourself to a smaller number of plugin choices than you're used to. To prove that you can actually get great mix results with less, go watch Jake mix a song with only 12 plugins total. And the actual mixing plugins used is even less than 12 because he's using a few different metering and analytical tools as part of the 12 plugins. So I hope you got something from this. Go have fun and implement all of the methods and techniques that we've talked about to get more depth in your next mix. Make sure to practice lots, and we'll see you on the next one. Peace.